Hello and welcome to yet another special broadcast of News 9 Plus at Raisina Dialogue 2023. In the new international order, amidst ongoing war, there's much focus on United Nations, what the United Nations will do and what kind of reforms are required now within the United Nations as well. And joining us is a very special guest today, Ambassador Shombi Sharp, the UN Resident Coordinator in India. Thank you so much, Ambassador Sharp, for joining us. My first question here at the Raisina Dialogue is about the conversations we have been holding. Since morning we've had the US Secretary of State, the Russian Foreign Minister as well. But still, at the conclusion of the G20, we still did not have a consensus. But at the Raisina Dialogue, how do you see the convergence of ideas and global leaders converging perhaps for some consensus?
Thank you. First, let me say, mujhe yahan bulane ke liye dhanyavad. It's always a pleasure to speak with you and to have this opportunity. As you've said, this is really an incredible moment. Every year, the Raisina Dialogue is kind of an important milestone on the calendar, geopolitical calendar. But I think this year is more important than most. Obviously, the overlapping, coinciding with the G20 process has allowed an incredible number of foreign ministers to participate. I think over 30 or something like that. But as you've said, and as is the whole dialogue is titled, Lighthouse in a Tempest, the world at the moment finds itself extremely fragmented, facing a number of challenges, as the Secretary General is constantly highlighting a polycrisis, as it were. And so the world needs leadership and countries coming together across divides to, even if they can't agree on everything, to at least make agreements that provide solutions for those countries, for those communities which are suffering the most at this moment in time. So we have, there's an ongoing food and fuel and fertilizer crisis. Climate change continues to move rapidly. We haven't completely emerged yet from the COVID pandemic. So, India has long been a very authorized and authentic voice for the Global South. India has been saying at the United Nations General Assembly, in the G20 process, here at Raisina Dialogue, has been saying that we cannot let differences such as war, which is bringing terrible human tragedy and cost, but we cannot let that also interrupt the needs of peoples, of communities, to survive and for basic development as well. So we need somehow to address both challenges at the same time. This is the message of India. I think that India is better placed than really probably any country at this point in time to have the best chance to bring different countries together across these divides, east, west, north, south. India has very strong bridges of trust and goodwill in all of those directions. So it doesn't mean it's easy. It's not easy. It's challenging. And as you mentioned, there are some barriers, hurdles that haven't been surmounted yet. But I'm pretty confident that it will be possible. And I definitely do believe that India has the best chance of being a lighthouse in the tempest, to use that terminology, at exactly this moment.
Ambassador, tell us, because Prime Minister Modi and India have had a very neutral approach since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. And they have always maintained that there needs to be negotiations and talks instead of a war. And one phrase that Prime Minister said at Bali summit was that this is not an era of war. And that has been ongoing when G20 is being hosted by India as well. You mentioned that. And one of the key factors in the very beginning of the G20 has been strengthening multilateralism. How do you see this approach of strengthening multilateralism? And do you think that this is going to be a success in your future? While the leaders have been converging here and everybody has had a say in New Delhi, have had a platform in New Delhi to have their own opinion, but will this really help?
Look, I think that, first of all, strengthening multilateralism absolutely is critical at this moment in time. We for all of its faults, we need multilateralism more now than ever before. The way how to strengthen multilateralism, basically it's countries and communities coming together from different viewpoints, but finding common solutions to common problems. How to do that, this requires reform. And India has been a champion and a strong voice for reform of multilateral systems for the benefit of, in particularly, of the developing world. We look at a number of different initiatives that India is bringing forward through the G20 process, for example, or taking initiatives that are already out there and bringing new life to those. One, of course, is the UN. If we talk about UN reform, the Secretary General launched a large reform process already a few years back in 2019. And that has delivered a number of different successes. It's in some parts still a process underway. But the reform that has remained elusive, of course, is the reform of the Security Council. How to help that body gain greater legitimacy, something that was designed in the aftermath of the Second World War in a different world, so to speak, and really does need to be modernized and updated to reflect the world as it is today. So, of course, India is a leading voice on that. And I think that there have been some positive movements in that direction in recent sort of months, but it remains, of course, still a challenge ahead. Other, let's say, more practical areas, reform or looking at the international financial architecture. Very, very important at this moment in time. And again, India is really pushing forward on this one, which is how do you reform the multilateral development banks? The World Bank, for example, now has sort of a roadmap that it's working on. There are a lot of different suggestions and ideas out there. How to allow those development banks to leverage the capital that they have already at a much higher gearing. How to bring in more capital to those development banks. How to increase the partnership with the private sector. The kind of mix of public and private sector lending to be made available to countries who are suffering. The Secretary General has just launched recently, a couple of weeks ago, the SDG stimulus plan. And this is something that we are hoping. We know that the G20 presidency is looking at this plan. The G20 members are looking at this plan. We're hoping that it can find traction because this is really the urgent need that the high-income countries of the world have had the ability through their own resources to provide stimulus opportunities for their economies, for their people during this time of crisis, during the COVID pandemic, during the supply chain disruptions and food and fuel crises. But the developing world, the global south, largely has not had that opportunity, that same opportunity. So the whole point is to avail those opportunities to get capital and inject liquidity and to allow the economy to keep moving and to allow countries to fund their social protection programs. Countries should not have to make a choice. Do we put food on people's tables or do we repay our debts? This is an impossible choice they shouldn't have to face. So debt forgiveness, debt restructuring, these are the issues, the very important and practical issues on the table that India really is pushing forward on in a very robust way. And I think there's a lot of traction and there's a lot of agreement in the international system as well. So the question now is just really buckling down and making those decisions and seeing it through.
Well, Ambassador, since you mentioned the UNSC reforms, I have to ask this. India has played a very significant role at the UN, be it India as a soft power or, diplomatically speaking, bringing converging ideas, bringing people together, bringing countries together. Also, India is the 5th largest economy. India is one of the most populated countries in the world. Do you think that it's time that perhaps India should be seriously considered as a member of the UNSC? And at a time when India is not a member of the UNSC, do you think the dysfunctionality of the UNSC only is further growing in days to come at a time when the crises are only growing?
Well, first of all, and again, I'm the UN resident coordinator representative for the Secretary General on the ground for development operations, as we say. So, these questions of UN Security Council reform, these are political questions that ultimately are with the member states. So the systems are there in place for the member states to make that call. But certainly, I mean, from my perspective, I think from anybody could not argue that, for example, a country like India joining the Security Council would not increase the legitimacy. Of course it would. It would very much increase the legitimacy of the body and better represent how the world looks today. As you mentioned, India's fifth largest economy might be the fourth, maybe third, according to some estimates, by even end of the decade, by the 2030 agenda. The importance of India on the global stage is increasing significantly. I mean, India's been a very important player for a long time, but we see now the scale of, for example, development best practices emerging out of India. Increasingly, we are helping to identify those and take those best practices to the international stage. Our UN presence here in India is a two-way relationship very much. You look at India's leadership in terms of peacekeeping. India is the largest provider of peacekeeping troops since the beginning. Truly, truly incredible and really innovating. Provided the very first all-women peacekeeping unit, in fact. You look at the COVID response. India has delivered over 2.2 billion vaccinations and was sort of in line with Pharmacy of the World, a really important player in terms of helping the COVAX facility, helping get COVID vaccinations to developing countries who otherwise couldn't afford that. You look at digital transformation. What's happening here in India is incredible. The ability now to, in a way, leapfrog and provide government services through the click of a button or just on a phone rather than paper-based systems. On and on and on, the list of ways in which India's both demonstrating development achievements, moving forward, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and the way in which India's voice on these matters, on these issues, perspective from a middle-income developing country perspective, the ear of the global South, that's a voice that the world is listening to like never before. And I think these streams are coming together again at exactly the moment that we need as we reach the SDG, the 2030 Agenda midpoint, just later this year in September at the General Assembly, literally weeks after India's G20 Leaders Summit. The world comes together and will stock take. Where are we on the 2030 Agenda? What's working, what's not working? And we know, unfortunately, a lot is not working. So this voice that India is bringing and the development solutions that India is demonstrating together will be really, really important and timely.
In fact, Sustainable Development Goals was going to be my next question, and the UNGA president had a very successful visit recently. We've had water as one of the key areas of achieving goals, not just for the UN, but for India as well. We've had a program called the Namami Gange, which is something that the UNGA president has been talking about as well. Would you like to talk a little about what has been on the agenda of the PGA and what are we looking towards in future?
Sure, absolutely. And I think so this water conference is really important. It's in a way one could imagine sort of a Paris moment for water and an understanding though of the importance, the centrality of water. And I think also the need to, there's been really a very necessary mainstreaming of climate action, climate change, these concepts through the various COPs in recent years, and this is critically important. But I think that we haven't paid enough attention to water in particular, really, as the life source, as the basis for so many of those conversations, livelihoods for people, obviously sustainability, weather, climate. Here in India, the Indo-Gangetic plains, the rivers, the Himalayas systems, incredibly important. So you mentioned the project and the Ganga, and which actually received recognition, an award from UN Environment Program as being an excellent example of how to protect an incredibly important life source, water source. So the President of the General Assembly, he's actually Shombi Sharp previously was an advisor of his country's president in this area. So he brings a refreshingly deep subject matter knowledge to the topic. It's not just that he's president of the General Assembly, but he actually knows a lot about the issue. So he came to India. We had a fantastic visit to a number of different places, institutions, and one visit was to Bengaluru. We went there and we saw some a really fantastic project in which they're treating the wastewater in the city and pumping that wastewater to the agricultural villages, towns, and areas around the city, and reviving the livelihoods of these rural communities. The water tables had decreased, agricultural productivity was low, livelihoods were negatively impacted. Now, as a result of that, this kind of circularity type of concept with water usage, the livelihoods return, agricultural productivity is increased, people are better off, and the water tables have risen. So you see this really holistic effect, and that was something that the President of the General Assembly very much took to heart and is sharing that experience back in New York and with his colleagues, and I think it will be featured in the upcoming water conference.
One final question, and I have to be a devil's advocate here as well, because you also spoke about the UN reforms, and that's been a key agenda topic. You know, Prime Minister Narendra Modi also spoke about UN reforms at the UNGA repeatedly. And one of the key reforms that he spoke about, and many others have been speaking about, is about a convention on terrorism. And, you know, India has been a victim of terrorism for a very long time. United States has been a victim of terrorism. And there has been a global cohesive action as well. But a lot of expected from the United Nations as well. There's a lot of criticism that happens that for decades together, the convention has been pending, but there hasn't been a consensus that is achieved, even on a definition of terrorism. How do you see this?
Well, here again, I think this is an area definitely that India has been a very important leading voice within the UN system, helping to push forward, first of all, the parameters of understanding of terrorism, and helping to identify practical areas, how the world can come together to prevent and to punish the crime of terrorism. We had the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, visited India back in October just of last year. He visited the memorial site in Mumbai of the terrorist attacks there, paid tribute to the victims and paid tribute to India's leadership on the issue. We had, India rather, as was president of the Security Council, the rotating basis, and also of the Counterterrorism Committee of the UN Security Council, invited all the members of the Security Council and the Counterterrorism Committee here to India, also to Mumbai, and really raised the profile on the urgent need to, example, prevent and address emerging ways in which terrorism is able to flourish within the digital world. So identifying new ways to leverage the power of technology, of artificial intelligence, and these types of tools to identify, prevent, and punish the crime of terrorism. So I think this has been a really, really important area of India's leadership within the UN system and helping the UN system to drive forward.
Ambassador Sharp, thank you so much for joining us here on News9 Plus.
Thank you. Dhanyabad.